Penelope Sinclair pressed her handkerchief to her cheeks for the third time that morning, and her sister-in-law Margaret rolled her eyes so hard it was a wonder they did not fall clean out of her head. "There she goes again," Margaret announced to the entire stagecoach, as if the other passengers had not already noticed Penelope weeping over the wildflowers growing alongside the rutted Montana road. Too sentimental for her own good, this one. Cries at sunsets, cries at babies, cries at old dogs sleeping in the sun. Who on God's green earth is going to want a wife who dissolves into tears every 5 minutes? Penelope lowered her handkerchief and stared out the window at the vast wilderness rolling past. It was June of 1876, and she was traveling to Utica, Montana, a mining town nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, because her brother Thomas had written that there were opportunities there for a schoolteacher. What Thomas had not mentioned in his letter was that Margaret would spend every waking moment cataloging Penelope's faults for anyone within earshot. "I was not crying," Penelope said quietly, though even she had to admit her voice lacked conviction. "I was simply moved by the beauty of the landscape. Is it so wrong to feel things deeply?" "It is when you are already 23 years old and still unmarried," Margaret shot back. "Men want practical women, Penelope. Women who can churn butter and mend clothes and keep a house running without getting weepy over every little thing. Your tender heart is going to leave you a spinster." The other passengers shifted uncomfortably. An older gentleman cleared his throat and pretended to be fascinated by his pocket watch. A young mother clutched her baby closer, as if sentimentality might be contagious. Penelope turned back to the window, blinking rapidly. She would not give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her cry again, even though the words stung like nettles. It was true that she felt things more deeply than most people seemed to. A beautiful sunrise could move her to tears. The sight of a child reunited with a lost puppy could make her chest ache with joy. When she read novels, she became so absorbed in the characters' lives that she mourned fictional deaths for days. Her mother had called it a gift before she died. Her father had called it a burden. Margaret called it a character flaw that would doom Penelope to lonely spinsterhood. The stagecoach hit a particularly deep rut, and everyone jolted in their seats. The driver shouted something unintelligible, and the horses whinnied in protest. Through the window, Penelope caught her first glimpse of Utica, Montana, and despite Margaret's withering presence beside her, she felt her heart lift. The town was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered along a single main street, with the mountains rising like sentinels in the distance. Smoke curled from chimneys, and she could see people moving about their business, tiny figures against the enormous landscape. It looked wild and untamed and absolutely nothing like Boston, where she had spent her entire life hemmed in by propriety and expectations. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of a building marked Utica General Store and Post Office. Penelope gathered her carpetbag and prepared to disembark, her legs stiff from 2 days of travel. Thomas was supposed to meet them here, and she scanned the small crowd that had gathered to see the stage arrive. "Penny!" a familiar voice called out, and then Thomas was there, his face tanned and weathered in a way it never had been back east. He looked healthy, happy even, despite the rough conditions Margaret had complained about in every letter she sent back to Boston. "Thomas!" Penelope allowed herself to be swept into a hug, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to her brother's clothes. "It is so good to see you." "And you, little sister." He pulled back, studying her face with concern. "You look tired. Was the journey very difficult?" "Nothing she has not made more difficult with her constant emotional displays," Margaret interjected, stepping down from the coach with considerably less grace than she probably intended. "I swear, Thomas, your sister wept over a bird's nest we passed somewhere in the Dakota Territory." "There were babies in it," Penelope said defensively, "and the mother bird was feeding them. It was sweet." Thomas laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Well, I'm glad your tender heart has not been hardened by the journey. Come on, both of you. Let me show you to the house. It is not fancy, but it is home." They walked down the main street, and Penelope tried not to stare at everything around her. The town was rougher than any place she had ever been. Men in dusty clothes and worn boots stood in clusters, talking and smoking. A few women in simple dresses hurried past with baskets over their arms. The buildings were mostly wood, and many looked as though they had been constructed in haste by people who valued function over form. The school is just down this way, Thomas said, pointing to a small structure near the end of the street. It has been without a proper teacher for 6 months now. The last one married a prospector and moved to Virginia City. The children have been making do with lessons from whoever has the time, but it is not ideal. I am happy to help, Penelope said, and she meant it. Teaching was one of the few things that made her feel useful, purposeful. Children did not judge her for crying at beautiful things or feeling too much. They understood that the world was full of wonders worth celebrating and tragedies worth mourning. Thomas and Margaret's house was a modest cabin on the edge of town, backing up against the foothills. It was clean and well-maintained, with a small garden out front where vegetables grew in neat rows. Inside, it was sparse but comfortable, with handmade furniture and cheerful curtains on the windows. "You will have the loft," Thomas said, gesturing to a ladder that led to a small sleeping area under the eaves. "I know it is not what you are accustomed to, but—" "It is perfect," Penelope interrupted, and she meant it. Through the small window in the loft, she could see the mountains, their peaks still dusted with snow even in June. "Truly, Thomas, thank you for inviting me." "Well, someone had to do something," Margaret muttered, but Thomas shot her a look that suggested she should hold her tongue. That night, Penelope lay in the loft, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier. Wolves howled in the distance, the wind whispered through the pines. Somewhere, a door banged shut. It was all so different from Boston, where the sounds were human and mechanical, where nature had been pushed to the edges and kept at bay. Here, nature was everywhere, wild and beautiful and overwhelming. Penelope fell asleep with tears on her cheeks, but they were not sad tears. They were tears of something else entirely, something she could not quite name. Hope, perhaps, or possibility. The next morning, Thomas took her to meet the town council, a group of 6 men who gathered in the back room of the general store to discuss town business. They looked Penelope up and down with varying degrees of skepticism. "She looks a bit delicate for frontier life," one man said, stroking his thick beard. "Begging your pardon, miss, but teaching out here is not like teaching in some fancy eastern city. The children are rough, the conditions are hard, winter comes early and stays late." "I understand," Penelope said, straightening her spine and meeting his gaze directly. "But I am a good teacher. I am patient, and I care about children's education. I believe every child deserves a chance to learn, regardless of their circumstances." Another man nodded approvingly. "Well said, Miss Sinclair. We would be glad to have you. The position does not pay much, I'm afraid. Room and board plus $20 a month. The schoolhouse has living quarters in the back, so you would not have to impose on your brother indefinitely." $20 a month was not much, but it was something. It was independence. It was a purpose. Penelope accepted immediately, and by the end of the week she had moved her few belongings into the small room behind the schoolhouse and begun preparing lessons for the term that would start in September. The schoolhouse was a single room with rough-hewn benches, a pot-bellied stove, and a blackboard that had seen better days. But it had good light from the windows, and Penelope could already imagine it filled with children's voices, their faces bright with curiosity and the joy of discovery. She spent her days cleaning and organizing, acquiring whatever books and supplies she could from families in town. She spent her evenings exploring the area around Utica, taking long walks along the river that ran through the valley, marveling at the wildflowers and the way the light turned golden as it filtered through the pine trees. It was on one of these walks in late July that she first encountered Quentin Jameson. She had ventured farther than usual, following a game trail up into the foothills, because she had spotted what she thought might be wild columbine growing among the rocks. She was so focused on the flowers that she did not notice the grizzly bear until it was too late. The bear was massive, easily 8 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs. It had been feeding on a berry patch just off the trail, and Penelope had stumbled right into its territory. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The bear's small eyes fixed on her, and it made a sound that was something between a roar and a warning grunt. Penelope froze. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she knew that was the worst thing she could do. The bear dropped to all fours and took a step toward her, and Penelope felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sentimentality this time, but from sheer terror. Then, someone grabbed her arm and pulled her backward so hard she nearly fell. A man stepped in front of her, putting himself between her and the bear. He was enormous, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair was dark and hung past his shoulders, and his arms were corded with muscles that strained against his buckskin shirt. "Do not move," he said, his voice low and calm. "Do not make a sound." The bear regarded them for a long moment, swaying slightly. The man stood perfectly still, one hand raised slightly, his posture somehow both non-threatening and absolutely immovable. Penelope could see the muscles in his back tensing, ready to act if the bear charged. After what felt like an eternity, the bear huffed, dropped its head, and ambled back to its berry patch, apparently deciding they were not worth the trouble. The man waited until the bear had moved a good distance away before he turned to Penelope. "You all right?" he asked, and up close Penelope could see that his eyes were a striking shade of gray like storm clouds. "I think so," she managed, though her voice came out shaky. "Thank you. I was foolish. I should not have wandered so far without paying attention." "You were lucky I was checking my traps nearby," he said. His gaze swept over her, assessing, and she felt suddenly aware of how she must look with her hair coming loose from its pins and her dress dusty from the trail. "What are you doing up here alone? Do you not know how dangerous these mountains can be?" "I was looking at flowers," Penelope said, and even to her own ears it sounded absurd. "The columbine. They are beautiful, and I wanted to see them up close." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise or perhaps amusement. "You came up here alone, risking bears and mountain lions and God knows what else to look at flowers?" "They are very beautiful flowers," Penelope said, lifting her chin. "And I know it sounds silly, but beauty matters. It matters that we take time to notice the wonderful things in the world." He stared at her for a long moment, and Penelope braced herself for mockery. Margaret's voice echoed in her head. Too sentimental, too emotional, too much feeling for a harsh world. But the man did not mock her. Instead, he said, "I am Quentin Jameson. I live up in these mountains, trapping and hunting mostly. Been here about 5 years now." "Penelope Sinclair," she replied. "I'm the new schoolteacher in Utica. I arrived last month from Boston." "Boston," he repeated, and now there was definitely amusement in his voice. "That explains it. You are a long way from home, Miss Sinclair." "This is my home now," she said, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "Or at least, I hope it will be." Quentin studied her for another moment, then nodded. "Come on. I will walk you back to town. It will be dark soon, and you do not want to be out here after sunset." They walked in silence at first, Quentin setting a pace that was easy to follow but still efficient. Penelope tried not to stare at him, but it was difficult. He moved through the wilderness with a grace that seemed impossible for someone so large, stepping over roots and rocks without even looking down. His buckskin clothes were worn but well made, and he carried a rifle slung over one shoulder with the ease of long familiarity. "Have you lived in the mountains long?" she finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. 5 years, like I said," Quentin replied. "Came out here after the war. Could not stand being around people anymore, all that noise and commotion. Mountains are quieter, cleaner in a way." "The war," Penelope repeated softly. "Were you in the army?" "Union soldier," he confirmed. "Saw things I would rather forget. When it was over, I just started walking west and did not stop until I hit these mountains. Been here ever since." Penelope wanted to ask more, to know what he had seen and what had driven him to such isolation, but she sensed that pushing would only make him retreat. So instead, she said, "I think I understand. Wanting to be somewhere beautiful after seeing terrible things. It helps, does it not, having beauty around you?" Quentin glanced at her, and for the first time, she saw something soften in his expression. "Most people think I am crazy living up here alone. But yeah, it helps. Helps a lot, actually." "You are not crazy," Penelope said firmly. "Or if you are, then so am I. I've been told my entire life that I am too sentimental, that I feel things too deeply. But I do not think it is wrong to care about beauty and goodness and all the things that make life worth living." "Too sentimental," Quentin repeated, and there was something thoughtful in his voice now. "Who told you that?" "Everyone," Penelope admitted. "My father, my sister-in-law, people back in Boston. They say I cry too easily, that I am moved by things that should not matter, that no man will want a wife who dissolves into tears over sunsets and baby birds." Quentin was quiet for a long moment, and Penelope immediately regretted saying so much. She had a habit of oversharing when she was nervous, of spilling her thoughts and feelings like water from an overturned bucket. But then Quentin said, "Sounds to me like they are the ones with the problem, not you." Penelope stopped walking, staring at him. "What?" He turned to face her, his gray eyes serious. "World's too hard, too cruel, too full of ugly things. If you can still find beauty in it, still feel moved by sunsets and flowers and baby birds, that is not a weakness. That is strength. That is proof that all the ugliness has not killed something important in you." Tears sprang to Penelope's eyes before she could stop them, and she let out a shaky laugh. "See? There I go again. You say something kind, and I start crying." "Nothing wrong with tears," Quentin said simply. "Better than being dead inside." He resumed walking, and Penelope hurried to keep up, her heart doing strange things in her chest. No one had ever talked to her like that before. No one had ever suggested that her sensitivity might be a strength rather than a flaw. By the time they reached the edge of Utica, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Penelope paused to look at it, unable to help herself, and felt the familiar swell of emotion in her chest. "Thank you," she said, turning to Quentin, "for saving me from the bear and for walking me home. I'm very grateful." Quentin nodded, his expression unreadable. "You be more careful from now on, Miss Sinclair. These mountains do not forgive mistakes." "I will," she promised, "but I cannot promise I will stop looking for beautiful things." The corner of his mouth twitched just slightly, as if he might be suppressing a smile. "I would not ask you to." Then he turned and disappeared back into the growing darkness, moving so silently that within seconds it was as if he had never been there at all. Penelope stood there for a long moment, watching the shadows, before finally making her way back to the schoolhouse. That night, she lay awake in her small room, replaying the encounter in her mind. Quentin Jameson was unlike any man she had ever met. He was rough and solitary, a mountain man who had chosen isolation over civilization. But there had been something in his eyes, some deep well of understanding that had reached into her chest and touched something she had thought no one else could see. She fell asleep thinking about storm-gray eyes and the way he had said, "That is strength." August arrived with long, hot days and cool nights. Penelope threw herself into preparing for the school term, but she found her thoughts drifting more and more often to Quentin Jameson. She wondered where exactly he lived in the mountains, what his days looked like, whether he was lonely up there all by himself. She tried to tell herself that it was silly to think so much about a man she had met only once, a man who lived in the wilderness and clearly preferred solitude to company. But her heart, sentimental and stubborn, refused to listen to reason. Then, one afternoon in mid-August, she was walking back from the general store when she saw him. He was standing outside the blacksmith shop, talking to the smithy about something. In the full light of day, surrounded by the town, he looked even more imposing. His buckskin clothes were clean but worn, and his long dark hair was tied back with a leather cord. Every line of his body spoke of strength and capability, from his broad shoulders to his muscular forearms. Penelope hesitated, unsure whether she should approach him or simply continue on her way. But then Quentin looked up and saw her, and something in his expression shifted. He said something to the blacksmith, then walked toward her with that same easy, ground-covering stride. "Miss Sinclair," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Good to see you are still in one piece. No more bear encounters, I hope?" "None," Penelope assured him, unable to suppress her smile. "I have been much more careful about where I wander. Though I confess, I miss the wildflowers up in the high country." "They're still there," Quentin said. "Just got to know where the bears like to feed and avoid those spots." "Perhaps you could show me," Penelope said, then immediately felt her cheeks flush. That had been far too forward. "I mean, if you ever have time. I know you must be very busy with your trapping and hunting." Quentin looked at her for a long moment, and Penelope could not read his expression. She braced herself for a polite refusal, for him to make some excuse about why he could not possibly spare the time to escort a silly city woman around the mountains. But instead, he said, "I could do that. Come Sunday, if the weather holds. I will meet you at the north end of town, where the trail starts. Bring water and wear sturdy boots. We will be doing some climbing." Penelope's heart leapt. "Really? You mean it?" "I do not say things I do not mean," Quentin replied, and there was no judgment in his voice, only simple honesty. Sunday morning, an hour past dawn. Do not be late. I will be there, Penelope promised, clutching her basket so tightly her knuckles turned white. Thank you, Mr. Jameson. Quentin, he said, just Quentin. Then he nodded once more and walked away, disappearing into the blacksmith's shop. Penelope stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then she practically floated back to the schoolhouse, her heart singing. Margaret's voice whispered in the back of her mind, warning her not to get her hopes up, reminding her that men like Quentin Jameson did not want sentimental women who cried over sunsets. But Penelope pushed the voice away. Quentin had been the one to say her sentimentality was strength. He had been the one to suggest she should not change who she was. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear, and Penelope was at the north end of town a full half hour before the appointed time. She wore her sturdiest dress and her best walking boots, and she had packed a canteen of water and some dried fruit in a small knapsack. Her hair was braided and pinned up tightly to keep it out of her face. Quentin appeared exactly on time, materializing from the forest with that uncanny silence of his. He looked her over, nodding approvingly at her practical attire. Good, he said. You are ready. Come on then. Daylight is wasting. They set off into the mountains, following a trail that was barely visible to Penelope's untrained eyes. Quentin moved with confidence, pointing out landmarks and warning her about loose rocks or tricky footing. He was patient with her slower pace, never making her feel rushed or incompetent. As they climbed higher, the air grew cooler and thinner. Penelope's legs began to ache, but she pushed through it, determined not to complain. The views were worth every bit of discomfort. The forest spread out below them like a green carpet, and the sky above was so blue it almost hurt to look at. There, Quentin said, pointing to a small meadow just off the trail. That is what you wanted to see. Penelope gasped. The meadow was filled with wildflowers, a riot of color against the green grass and gray rocks. Columbine, lupin, Indian paintbrush, and dozens of other species she could not name, all grew together in glorious profusion. Oh, she breathed, and felt tears prick at her eyes. Oh, it is beautiful. Thought you might like it, Quentin said, and there was something gentle in his voice that made Penelope's heart squeeze. They sat in the meadow for a long while, Penelope exclaiming over different flowers, while Quentin sat quietly nearby, watching her with those storm-gray eyes. She asked him the names of the plants he knew, and he answered patiently, even admitting when he did not know something. I never paid much attention to that sort of thing before, he confessed. Knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous, but I never really looked at them, not the way you do. How do I look at them? Penelope asked, curious. Quentin was quiet for a moment, considering. Like they matter. Like they are not just scenery or resources, but something worth appreciating for their own sake. They do matter, Penelope said softly. Everything beautiful matters. It reminds us that there is more to life than just surviving, that there is joy and wonder and goodness in the world, even when things are hard. Quentin looked at her intently, and Penelope felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had done it again, said too much, revealed too much of her overly sentimental heart, but Quentin just nodded slowly. I think you might be right about that. They stayed in the meadow until the sun was high overhead, then made their way back down the mountain. Quentin showed her a shortcut that brought them out near the river, where they stopped to refill their canteens and rest in the shade of some cottonwood trees. Can I ask you something? Penelope said, watching the water flow past. You can ask, Quentin replied. Cannot promise I will answer. Why did you agree to bring me up here? You seem like someone who values your solitude. Why spend your day showing a stranger some wildflowers? Quentin was silent for so long that Penelope thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, Because when you talked about beauty mattering, something in me recognized it. Truth, I mean. I've been living up in these mountains for 5 years, and I thought I was doing it because I wanted to be alone. But maybe part of it was that I needed to be somewhere beautiful, somewhere that reminded me there was still good in the world. His words were halting, as if he was not used to explaining himself, but they struck Penelope with the force of revelation. This man, this strong, solitary mountain man, understood her in a way no one else ever had. I am glad you brought me, she said quietly. This has been one of the best days I have had in a very long time." Quentin looked at her, and for a moment, Penelope thought she saw something vulnerable in his expression, something that matched the feeling in her own chest. "Me too," he said. After that day, Quentin began appearing in Utica more regularly. He would stop by the schoolhouse to bring Penelope things he had found in the mountains, interesting rocks, unusual pine cones, once even a perfect eagle feather. He never stayed long, always making excuses about errands he needed to run or traps he needed to check. But Penelope treasured each visit, each small offering. The town noticed, of course. In a place as small as Utica, nothing went unobserved for long. Women whispered behind their hands when Quentin walked past. Men exchanged knowing looks when he asked after Miss Sinclair at the general store. Margaret was beside herself with conflicting emotions. On one hand, Quentin Jameson was about as far from an ideal match as one could imagine a rough mountain man with no property, no prospects, and no interest in civilized society. On the other hand, he was a man showing interest in Penelope, which was more than anyone else had done. "I suppose he is better than nothing," Margaret said one evening when Penelope came to dinner, "though I cannot imagine what you find to talk about with such an uncivilized person." "Quentin is not uncivilized," Penelope said, bristling. "He is thoughtful and kind and more observant than any man I have ever met. He notices things. He pays attention to the world around him." "He lives in a cave like some kind of wild animal," Margaret countered. "How is that civilized?" "He does not live in a cave," Penelope said, though actually she was not entirely sure where Quentin lived. He had never invited her to his home, and she had not asked. And even if he did, that would not make him any less worthy of respect. Thomas intervened before the argument could escalate. "Margaret, leave Penny alone. Quentin Jameson is a good man, served honorably in the war, minds his own business, and has never caused trouble in town. If he makes Penny happy, that's all that matters." Penelope shot her brother a grateful look, and he winked at her. But Margaret's words nagged at her. She realized that despite spending several Sundays hiking with Quentin, despite the gifts he brought and the conversations they shared, she knew very little about his actual life. Where did he live? What did his home look like? What did he do on all those days when she did not see him? The next time he appeared at the schoolhouse, she asked, "Would you show me where you live?" The words tumbled out before she could second-guess herself. "I know it is forward of me to ask, but I am curious. You have shown me so much of the mountains, but I do not even know where you call home." Quentin looked surprised, then uncertain. "It is not much to see, Miss Sinclair. Just a cabin I built myself. Pretty rough." "I do not care if it is rough," Penelope said. "I would like to see it if you would be willing to show me." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Next Sunday, if you are sure. It is a longer hike than we have done before, though. We would need to leave at dawn and plan to be out most of the day." "I am sure," Penelope said firmly. "I will be ready." That Sunday, Penelope woke before dawn, too excited to sleep. She dressed in her most practical clothes and packed food and water for the day. When she met Quentin at the edge of town, the sky was just beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep blue. They hiked for hours, climbing higher into the mountains than Penelope had ever gone. The trees changed as they ascended, from cottonwoods and aspens to pine and spruce. The air grew thinner and colder, and Penelope's breath came harder, but she pushed on, following Quentin's broad back as he navigated the treacherous terrain. Finally, they emerged into a small valley, and Penelope caught sight of Quentin's cabin. It was nestled against the mountainside, built from logs that had been carefully fitted together. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and there was a small corral beside the cabin where a sturdy-looking mule grazed. "This is it," Quentin said, and Penelope could hear a note of uncertainty in his voice, as if he was worried about what she would think. But Penelope was enchanted. The cabin was small but sturdy, with real glass in the windows and a solid door. The setting was spectacular, with the mountains rising behind it and a clear stream running through the valley. Wildflowers grew everywhere, and the air smelled of pine and clean water. "It is wonderful," she said, and meant it. "Quentin, you built this yourself?" "Over my first 2 years here," he confirmed. "Started with just a lean-to and gradually improved it. It is not fancy, but it keeps out the cold and the rain." He showed her inside, and Penelope took in every detail. The cabin was one large room with a sleeping area on one side and a small kitchen area on the other. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and there were shelves lined with supplies and tools. Furs covered the floor, and the furniture, though simple, was well crafted. What surprised her most were the small touches that revealed Quentin's hidden depths: a stack of books on a shelf near his bed, carefully pressed wildflowers between the pages of what looked like a journal, a small carving of a bear, exquisitely detailed, sitting on the mantel. "You read," she said, picking up one of the books. It was a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman. "Not much else to do during the long winter nights," Quentin said, looking slightly embarrassed. "And I like the words, the way they describe things." Penelope's heart swelled with affection. This man, this supposedly uncivilized mountain man, read poetry and pressed flowers and carved beautiful things from wood. "You are full of surprises, Quentin Jameson," she said softly. He looked at her, and something shifted in the air between them. The space that had always existed, that careful distance of propriety and uncertainty, suddenly felt smaller. "Can I tell you something?" Quentin said, his voice rough. "Something I've been thinking about." "Of course," Penelope whispered. "When you first told me that people said you were too sentimental, I thought they were fools. Still do. But the more time I spend with you, the more I realize it is not just that you are not too sentimental. It is that you are exactly sentimental enough. You care about things the way they should be cared about. You look at the world, and you see what is actually there, all the beauty and wonder that most people miss because they are too busy or too hardened to notice." He took a step closer, and Penelope's heart began to race. "I have been alone for 5 years, Quentin continued. Thought that was what I wanted, what I needed. But then you showed up, crying over baby birds and getting teary about sunsets, and something in me woke up, something I thought was dead." "What was it?" Penelope asked, though she thought she might already know. "Hope," Quentin said simply. "Hope that maybe I did not have to stay isolated forever. That maybe there was someone in the world who could understand why I needed the mountains, why beauty matters, why it is important to care about things even when caring hurts." Tears were streaming down Penelope's face now, and she did not even try to stop them. "I understand all of that," she said. "I understand it perfectly." Quentin reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and gently brushed the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. His hands were rough and calloused, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "They said you were too sentimental," he said softly. "But I think you are perfect. I think you will care for my heart like it matters, the way you care about everything that matters." "I will," Penelope promised, her voice breaking. "I will care for your heart like it is the most precious thing in the world, because it is. Because you are." Quentin bent his head, and Penelope rose on her toes, and their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, full of all the longing and understanding that had been building between them for weeks. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Penelope Sinclair," he said. "I know it is too soon and too sudden, but it is true. I love you." "I love you too," Penelope whispered back. "I think I have loved you since the moment you stepped between me and that bear." They spent the rest of the day at the cabin, talking about everything and nothing. Quentin told her stories about his years in the mountains, the harsh winters and the quiet summers, the wildlife he had encountered and the peace he had found. Penelope told him about Boston, about her mother who had died when she was young, and her father who had never understood her, about her dreams of making a difference as a teacher. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Quentin walked Penelope back down the mountain. They held hands the entire way, neither wanting to break the physical connection. At the edge of town, where they would have to part, Quentin pulled her close one more time. "Come back next Sunday," he said, "and the Sunday after that. Keep coming back until we figure out how to make this work." "I will," Penelope promised. "I will come back every Sunday for the rest of my life if that is what it takes." The following weeks passed in a blur of happiness. Penelope threw herself into her teaching as the school term began in September, finding joy in her young students' eager faces and curious questions. But her Sundays belonged to Quentin, and she lived for those precious days in the mountains. They talked about the future, about what it would mean for them to be together. Marriage was the obvious answer, but it brought complications. Quentin's cabin was too remote for Penelope to live there and still teach. The schoolhouse was too small and too public for Quentin, who still struggled with being around people for extended periods. "We could build something in between," Quentin suggested one Sunday in late September. "There's a spot about halfway between town and my cabin. Good water, good timber, flat enough to build on. We could have a place there, somewhere you could get to the school and I could get to the high country when I needed to." "We could have a garden," Penelope said, her eyes lighting up. "And maybe some chickens. I've always wanted chickens." Quentin laughed, the sound rich and warm. "You can have all the chickens you want, darling. Whatever makes you happy." But before they could make any concrete plans, winter arrived early and hard. By mid-October, snow was falling in the high country, and Quentin's visits to town became less frequent. Penelope worried about him up in his cabin, alone and cut off as the snow deepened. "I will be fine," he assured her during one of his increasingly rare visits. "I have been through 5 winters up there already. I know what I'm doing." "But you were alone then," Penelope protested. "Now you have me to worry about you. That changes things." Quentin pulled her into his arms right there on the street, not caring who saw. "And you have me worrying about you down here. But we will both be fine. Winter does not last forever. Come spring, we will start building that house, all right?" "All right," Penelope agreed reluctantly. The winter of 1876-1877 was one of the harshest Montana had seen in years. Snow piled up in drifts taller than a man. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid in its buckets overnight. Utica became almost completely isolated, with the stage stopping its runs and supplies running dangerously low. Penelope threw herself into teaching, keeping the children busy and their minds occupied during the long, dark days. She did not see Quentin at all from November through January, and the not knowing gnawed at her. Was he safe? Was he warm enough? Did he have enough food? She found herself praying every night, something she had not done regularly since her mother's death. Please let him be safe. Please let him be well. Please let spring come soon. In February, when Penelope was beginning to despair of ever seeing Quentin again, there was a knock on the schoolhouse door late one evening. She opened it to find him standing there, covered in snow, his face haggard with exhaustion. "Quentin!" She pulled him inside, her hands shaking as she helped him out of his snow-covered coat. "What are you doing here? The snow is still too deep for travel." "I had to see you," he said, his voice rough. "Had to make sure you were all right. I have been going crazy up there, not knowing if you were safe, if you had enough food, if you were warm enough." "I am fine," Penelope assured him, even as tears streamed down her face. "But you could have died coming down here in these conditions." "I know these mountains," Quentin said. "I would not have come if I did not think I could make it. But Penelope, I realized something up there in the dark and the cold. I realized that I do not want to spend another winter apart from you. I do not want to spend another day apart from you, if I can help it." He pulled something from his pocket, a small wooden box, intricately carved. Inside was a ring, simple but beautiful, made of twisted silver with a small piece of turquoise set in it. "I made the box," Quentin said, "but I had the smithy make the ring. The turquoise is from a deposit I found in the mountains. It reminded me of your eyes in the sunlight." Penelope could barely see through her tears. "Quentin, marry me," he said, dropping to one knee right there in the schoolhouse. "I know I am not what anyone would call a good prospect. I know I am rough and uncivilized and too comfortable with solitude. But I love you with everything I have, and I promise I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes." "Yes," Penelope said without hesitation. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Quentin stood and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that made her knees weak and her heart sore. "I have to go back up before the next storm hits," he said when they finally broke apart. "But come spring, we get married, and we start building that house, and we spend the rest of our lives together. Does that sound good to you?" "It sounds perfect," Penelope said, clutching his hand. "But please be careful going back. Please come back to me safe." "I will," he promised. "Nothing could keep me away from you now." He left before dawn, disappearing back into the snowy wilderness. Penelope stood at the window and watched him go, the ring on her finger catching the lamplight. She touched it gently, marveling at the beauty of the turquoise, at the thought and care that had gone into creating it. The rest of the winter passed more quickly after that. Knowing that Quentin was safe, that he loved her, that they would be married come spring, it made even the darkest days brighter. When the snow finally began to melt in March, Penelope felt as though the world was waking up after a long sleep. And when Quentin appeared in town on a bright April morning, looking healthy and strong and more handsome than ever, she ran to him without caring about propriety or who might see. "Hello, darling," he said, catching her in his arms. "Ready to start planning a wedding?" "I've been ready since the moment you proposed," Penelope said, laughing through happy tears. They were married in May of 1877 in a simple ceremony at the church in Utica. Thomas gave Penelope away, and Margaret cried, though whether from happiness or resignation, Penelope could not be sure. Half the town showed up, curious to see the match between the sentimental schoolteacher and the reclusive mountain man. Penelope wore a dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers woven into her hair. Quentin wore his best buckskin pants and a new shirt he had bought specially for the occasion, with his long hair neatly tied back. When the preacher asked if he took Penelope to be his wife, Quentin's "I do" rang out clear and strong, with no hesitation, and when Penelope said her vows, her voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I knew she would cry at her own wedding," Margaret whispered loudly, but Thomas shushed her, and Quentin just smiled and gently wiped away Penelope's tears with his thumbs, the way he always did. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the town hall with food and dancing. Quentin was stiff and uncomfortable at first, not used to being around so many people, but he relaxed as the evening went on, especially when Penelope pulled him out onto the dance floor. "I am not much of a dancer," he warned, but he followed her lead, his strong arms holding her steady as they moved to the music. "You are doing fine," Penelope assured him, her eyes shining. "You are doing everything fine, Quentin. You are the finest man I have ever known." That night, they stayed in the small room behind the schoolhouse, which Penelope had filled with candles and wildflowers. Quentin was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure Penelope felt safe and cherished. And when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like two pieces that had always been meant to fit together finally finding their place. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, talking quietly and making plans for the future. "I will start cutting timber for the house tomorrow," Quentin said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Penelope's arm. "Should have the frame up by the end of June if the weather holds." "I can help," Penelope offered. "I'm stronger than I look," Quentin chuckled. "I know you are, darling, but you still have teaching to do. Once the school term ends in July, then you can help all you want." They fell silent for a while, just enjoying being close to each other. Then Penelope said softly, "Are you happy, Quentin? Truly happy?" "Happier than I ever thought I could be," he answered without hesitation. "You gave me something I did not even know I was missing, Penelope. You gave me a reason to rejoin the world. And you gave me acceptance," Penelope said. "You made me feel like being sentimental was not something to apologize for. You made me feel valued exactly as I am." "That is because you are valuable exactly as you are," Quentin said firmly. "Do not you ever forget that." True to his word, Quentin began work on their house the very next day. He chose a spot just as he had described, halfway between town and his mountain cabin, in a small meadow with a spring-fed stream running through it. The location was perfect, giving them privacy while still being accessible enough for Penelope to reach the school when needed. Penelope visited whenever she could, bringing lunch and watching in fascination as the house took shape. Quentin worked with a precision and skill that spoke of years of practice. Each log was carefully chosen and fitted, each joint perfectly matched. He built the house to last, creating something that could withstand the harsh Montana winters and provide a safe, comfortable home for them both. When the school term ended in July, Penelope joined him in earnest, helping however she could. She chinked the gaps between logs with mud and moss. She helped position smaller timbers for the roof frame. She cleared stones from the area where they would eventually plant a garden. It was hard work, harder than anything Penelope had done before. Her hands blistered and her back ached, but she loved every minute of it, loved working side by side with her husband to create their future together. By late August, the house was finished enough to move into. It was larger than Quentin's mountain cabin, with 2 rooms, a main living area, and a smaller bedroom. There was a real stove for cooking, a stone fireplace for heat, and proper windows that let in the light. The furniture was simple but sturdy, most of it built by Quentin himself. Penelope made curtains from fabric she bought at the general store and filled the house with small touches, wildflowers in mason jars, quilts she had sewn, books on shelves that Quentin built. She even started her flock of chickens, with 6 hens and a rooster that Quentin bought from a farmer outside town. The house was not fancy, but it was theirs, and it was filled with love. As summer turned to fall, they settled into a rhythm. Penelope taught during the week, walking the hour to town each morning and back each evening. Quentin worked his trapline and hunted, providing meat and furs that they could sell or trade. On weekends, they explored the mountains together, with Quentin teaching Penelope all the skills she needed to survive in the wilderness. She learned to read tracks, to find water, to identify edible plants. She learned to shoot a rifle, though she hoped she would never have to use it on anything larger than a rabbit. She learned the rhythms of the forest, the signs that told her when weather was changing or when animals were nearby. But mostly, she learned what it meant to be loved completely and without reservation. Quentin showed her every day, in 100 small ways, that he valued her exactly as she was. When she cried at a beautiful sunset, he wrapped his arms around her and told her he loved that she could still see beauty in the world. When she fretted over a student who was struggling, he listened patiently and helped her think through solutions. When she woke from nightmares about being alone again, he held her close and promised he was not going anywhere. Their first winter together was harsh, but they faced it as a team. They were snowed in for days at a time, but Penelope never felt trapped or bored. She and Quentin read aloud to each other, played cards, and talked about everything under the sun. They made love by the fire while snow piled up outside their windows. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the small compromises and adjustments that turned 2 separate people into a partnership. Spring arrived in 1878 with a profusion of wildflowers, and Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She told Quentin one evening in May, nervous about how he would react. They had not specifically talked about children, though she'd assumed they both wanted them eventually. "I am going to be a father," Quentin said, his eyes wide with wonder. Then a huge smile spread across his face, and he picked her up and spun her around, just as he had when she agreed to marry him. "Penelope, that is the best news I have ever heard." "You are happy?" she asked, laughing and crying at the same time. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Quentin said, setting her down gently as if she might break. "We are going to have a baby, our baby. I'm going to be a father and you are going to be a mother, and our child is going to be so loved." The pregnancy was easier than Penelope had feared. She had some morning sickness in the early months, but it passed, and by summer she felt better than ever. Her body changed and grew, and Quentin watched it all with fascination and tenderness. "You are so beautiful," he would tell her, his hands gentle on her swollen belly. "The most beautiful thing I have ever seen." "I am enormous," Penelope would protest, but she could not keep from smiling. She did feel beautiful, cherished, loved in a way she had never imagined possible. In January of 1879, during one of the coldest weeks of winter, Penelope went into labor. Quentin rode through a snowstorm to fetch the midwife, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. He then paced the main room of their house like a caged mountain lion, wincing every time he heard Penelope cry out. "First babies take time," Mrs. Patterson told him, but her expression was kind. "She is doing fine, Mr. Jameson. Your wife is stronger than she looks." "I know she is," Quentin said, but the worry did not leave his face until, hours later, he heard the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the bedroom with a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Jameson, a big, healthy boy with a good set of lungs on him." Quentin was in the bedroom in an instant, kneeling beside the bed where Penelope lay, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Quentin, meet your son," she said softly, tears streaming down her face. Quentin looked at the baby, his son, and felt something crack open in his chest. The infant had a shock of dark hair and was red-faced from crying, but to Quentin, he was perfect. "He is beautiful," Quentin said, his voice breaking, "just like his mother." "He looks like you," Penelope said. "Strong and determined. I think we should name him William, after your father." Quentin's eyes filled with tears. He had not spoken much about his family, about the father who had died when he was young. But Penelope knew, because she always knew, because she paid attention to the things that mattered. "William," he repeated. "William Jameson, that's a good name." He reached out carefully, and Penelope placed the baby in his arms. Quentin held his son with exquisite gentleness, his large, scarred hands cradling the tiny body as if it were made of glass. "Hello, William," he said softly. "I am your father, and I promise you, I am going to do everything in my power to give you a good life. You and your mother. You are everything to me." William opened his eyes at the sound of his father's voice, and Quentin could have sworn the baby looked right at him, seeing him, knowing him. It was probably just chance, but it felt like a moment of recognition, of connection. Penelope watched her husband hold their son, and she cried again, but they were tears of pure joy. This was what she had always dreamed of, a family built on love and acceptance, where every member was valued and cherished. "We did it," she said softly. "We made a family." "Best thing I ever did," Quentin said, carefully returning the baby to her arms so she could nurse him. "Loving you, marrying you, making this life together. Best decisions I ever made." As William grew, it became clear that he had inherited his mother's sensitive nature and his father's strength. He cried easily but recovered quickly. He was fascinated by everything around him, studying insects and birds with intense concentration. He was also fearless, climbing things he should not climb and exploring places he should not explore, giving his parents equal measures of pride and heart attacks. "He is just like you," Penelope would tell Quentin, laughing as she watched their toddler son scale a woodpile like it was a mountain. "He is like both of us," Quentin would reply, swooping in to catch William before he could fall. "Brave and curious and full of feelings, perfect combination." The years passed in a blur of happiness. William was joined by a sister, Margaret, in 1881, named after Penelope's sister-in-law, who had softened considerably toward Penelope and Quentin after William's birth. Margaret had her mother's golden hair and her father's gray eyes, and she was as boisterous and loud as William was quiet and contemplative. Then came another son, Thomas, in 1883, named for Penelope's brother. Thomas was the easiest of all the children, a sunny-natured baby who rarely cried and seemed content with whatever was happening around him. Penelope continued teaching, now with her own children in her classroom. Quentin continued trapping and hunting, though as the children grew, he spent more time close to home, not wanting to miss any moments of their lives. The house was expanded twice to accommodate the growing family. Quentin built a proper barn for the animals they had accumulated: the chickens, 2 cows, a pig, and several horses. Penelope's garden flourished, providing vegetables for the table and flowers for the house. They faced challenges, of course. There were hard winters when supplies ran low. There were years when the pelts did not bring good prices. William broke his arm falling from a tree when he was 7, and Margaret nearly died from a fever when she was 4. But through it all, they had each other, and that made every difficulty bearable. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quentin took Penelope back to the meadow where he had first shown her the wildflowers. It was June, and the meadow was once again filled with color. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" Quentin asked, holding her hand as they stood among the flowers. "Of course," Penelope said. "I cried because it was so beautiful." "You did," Quentin agreed, smiling. "And I realized that day that I was falling in love with you, this woman who cried over flowers and saw beauty everywhere, even in a world that can be so hard." "I am still that woman," Penelope said softly. "I still cry at beautiful things. I still feel everything deeply. I hope you do not regret it." Quentin turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Regret it? Penelope, marrying you was the best decision I ever made. You did not just care for my heart like it mattered. You brought my heart back to life. You made me believe I could be part of the world again, that I deserved happiness and love and family." "You gave me the same thing," Penelope said, tears streaming down her face. "You made me believe that being sentimental was not a flaw, that my tears and my feelings were not too much. You loved me exactly as I am." "And I always will," Quentin promised. "For the rest of my life and beyond, I will love you exactly as you are." They kissed there among the wildflowers, just as they had 10 years before, and it felt like coming home. The children grew. William became a tracker and guide, using the skills his father had taught him to help settlers navigate the mountains. Margaret became a teacher like her mother, taking over the school in Utica when Penelope decided to focus on teaching younger children from their home. Thomas became a rancher, expanding the small homestead into a proper cattle operation. All three children married and had children of their own, filling Penelope and Quentin's later years with grandchildren who ran through the house and called them Grandma and Grandpa. The house that had once seemed so spacious was now always full of noise and laughter and life. Penelope and Quentin grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down. But the love between them never dimmed. Every morning, Quentin would wake first and watch Penelope sleep, marveling that this woman had chosen him. Every evening, Penelope would sit beside him on the porch and watch the sunset, still moved to tears by the beauty of it, still feeling Quentin's arm around her shoulders. "Still sentimental after all these years," Quentin would tease gently. "Still thinking it is perfect," Penelope would reply. On a warm September evening in 1915, when Penelope was 62 and Quentin was 65, they sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. The mountains rose behind them, the same mountains where they had met, where they had fallen in love, where they had built a life together. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Penelope asked, her head resting on Quentin's shoulder. "If I had not wandered into that bear's territory? If you had not been there to save me?" "All the time," Quentin admitted. "And every time I thank God that you did wander into that bear's territory. Because if you had not, I might have spent the rest of my life alone in these mountains, thinking that was what I wanted. And I might have spent the rest of my life believing I was too sentimental for anyone to love," Penelope said. "Instead, we got this," Quentin said, gesturing to the scene before them, the house they had built, the family they had created, the life they had made together. "We got everything." "We did," Penelope agreed, tears in her eyes. "We got everything and more." Their oldest grandson, William's boy, ran up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "Grandpa, can you tell us the story about the bear again? About how you saved Grandma?" Quentin laughed. "You have heard that story 100 times, boy." "But we like it," the boy insisted. "Please?" So Quentin told the story again, with Penelope adding her own embellishments and corrections, while the grandchildren sat at their feet and listened with rapt attention. He told them about the bear, about the wildflowers, about how their grandmother had cried at beautiful things and how he had realized that was not a weakness, but a strength. "And then what happened?" the youngest grandchild asked, even though she knew the answer. "Then I married the most wonderful woman in the world," Quentin said, pulling Penelope closer, "and we lived happily ever after." "Just like a fairy tale," the child said, satisfied. "Better than a fairy tale," Penelope corrected gently, "because this is real. All of this, the love, the family, the life we built, it is all real." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Penelope felt the familiar swell of emotion in her chest. After all these years, after everything they had been through and built together, she was still moved by beauty. She was still sentimental, still quick to tears, still feeling everything deeply. But now she knew what Quentin had tried to tell her all those years ago. It was not a flaw. It was a gift. It was the ability to see and appreciate all the goodness and wonder in the world, even when things were hard. It was the capacity to love deeply and completely, without reservation or fear. She had cared for Quentin's heart like it mattered, just as he had said she would, and he had cared for hers with the same devotion and tenderness. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting, something that would continue on through their children and grandchildren and all the generations to come. "I love you," she whispered to Quentin, not for the first time and not for the last. "I love you too," he whispered back. "Always have, always will." And there, surrounded by family, with the mountains standing eternal guard behind them and the setting sun painting everything in gold, Penelope Sinclair Jameson was exactly where she was meant to be. The woman they had said was too sentimental had found a man who thought she was perfect. and together they had built a life full of love, laughter, tears, and beauty, a life that proved, beyond any doubt, that caring deeply was not a weakness, but the greatest strength of all. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and celebrations, by births and, eventually, deaths. Thomas, Penelope's brother, passed away in 1918, and Margaret followed a year later. Penelope mourned them both deeply, crying for days, but Quentin was there beside her, holding her through the grief, reminding her that it was all right to feel things fully, even painful things. Their own children remained close, visiting regularly with growing families of their own. William had 4 children and made a good living guiding hunters and settlers through the mountain passes. Margaret taught 2 generations of children in Utica, becoming as beloved as her mother had been. Thomas had 5 children and built the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Penelope and Quentin took joy in every milestone, every achievement, every small moment of grace. They were there when William's oldest daughter graduated from the new high school that had been built in Utica. They were there when Margaret's son published his first book of poetry, a talent he had inherited from his grandmother's love of beautiful words. They were there when Thomas's twins were born, 2 boys who looked so much like their grandfather Quentin that it made everyone laugh. As they moved into their 70s, their bodies began to slow more noticeably. Quentin's hands, once so strong and capable, developed arthritis that made certain tasks difficult. Penelope's eyes grew weaker, requiring spectacles to read. But neither complained. They had lived full lives, rich with love and purpose, and they were grateful for every day they had together. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1917, the entire family gathered at the homestead for a celebration. The house and barn were bursting with people, children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. Tables were set up in the yard, groaning under the weight of food that everyone had contributed. There was music and dancing and laughter that echoed off the mountains. At the height of the celebration, William stood up and called for everyone's attention. "I want to propose a toast," he said, raising his glass, "to my parents, Quentin and Penelope Jameson. They taught us what real love looks like. Not the easy romantic kind you read about in books, but the kind that weathers storms and grows stronger over time, the kind that builds something lasting. They taught us that being different is not a flaw," Margaret added, standing beside her brother. "That sensitivity and strength can exist in the same person, that the ability to feel deeply and care fully is a gift, not a burden." "They taught us that home is not a place, but the people you love," Thomas said, joining his siblings. "And they gave us the best home anyone could ask for." Penelope was crying, of course, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. But she was smiling too, her hand clasped tightly in Quentin's. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, his eyes never leaving her face. 40 years, he said softly, so only she could hear. "And I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "So would I," Penelope whispered back, "every single moment." The party continued late into the night, and Penelope and Quentin sat on the porch, watching their family celebrate around them. They could pick out each face in the crowd their children, now gray-haired themselves, their grandchildren, ranging from teenagers to toddlers, even the newest great-grandchildren, barely old enough to walk. "We built something good here," Quentin said, his arm around Penelope's shoulders in that familiar, comforting way. "We did," Penelope agreed. "Something that will last long after we're gone." "Speaking of which," Quentin said, his tone turning more serious, "we should probably talk about that, about what happens when one of us goes." Penelope stiffened slightly. It was a conversation they had been avoiding, neither wanting to think about a time when they would be separated. But Quentin was right. They were not young anymore, and it was a conversation that needed to happen. "I do not want to think about it," Penelope admitted. "The thought of being without you." "I know," Quentin interrupted gently, "but we need to talk about it anyway, because here is what I need you to know, Penelope. If I go first, I need you to keep living. Not just existing, but really living. Keep teaching if you want to. Keep crying at sunsets. Keep finding beauty in the world. Promise me you will not just shut down." "I do not know if I could do that without you," Penelope said, fresh tears spilling over. "You can," Quentin said firmly. You are the strongest person I know, even if you do not always believe it, and you will have our children and grandchildren around you. You will not be alone." "But I will be without you," Penelope said, her voice breaking. "Only for a little while," Quentin said. "I believe we will see each other again, in whatever comes after this. But until then, I need to know you will be all right." Penelope nodded, even though the thought of being without Quentin was almost unbearable. "And what if I go first? What will you do?" "The same thing," Quentin said. "Keep living. Keep finding reasons to get up in the morning, though I admit it will be hard. You are the best reason I have ever had for anything." They sat in silence for a while, holding each other, listening to the sounds of their family celebrating around them. Finally, Penelope said, "I am glad we had this talk, even though it is painful. And I promise, if you go first, I will do my best to keep living fully, for you and for our family." "That is all I ask," Quentin said, kissing the top of her head. But as it turned out, they did not have to face that separation for many more years. They continued on together through the 1920s, watching the world change around them. Montana became a state. Cars began appearing on the roads. The frontier they had known was slowly being tamed, civilized, transformed into something new. But in their corner of the mountains, time seemed to move more slowly. The wildflowers still bloomed every spring. The snow still fell deep in winter. The mountains still stood eternal and unchanging, a reminder of something greater than human concerns. Penelope continued teaching, now focusing on the youngest children in the family, the great-grandchildren who came to visit. She taught them their letters and numbers, but more importantly, she taught them to appreciate beauty, to feel deeply, to care about the world around them. Quentin continued working the land, though on a smaller scale. He maintained the barn and the garden, repaired fences, and made sure the animals were well cared for. He also continued his wood carving, creating beautiful pieces that he gave to family members for birthdays and holidays. They took walks together every evening when weather permitted, following the same trails they had walked for decades. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they were silent, but always they were together, their hands clasped, their steps matching in the unconscious synchronization of two people who had spent a lifetime side by side. In the autumn of 1925, when Penelope was 72 and Quentin was 75, Quentin became ill. It started as what seemed like a simple cold but developed into pneumonia. The doctor came and did what he could, but the infection settled deep in Quentin's lungs, and despite everyone's best efforts, he grew weaker. Penelope refused to leave his side. She sat beside his bed day and night, holding his hand, talking to him, reading to him from the books of poetry they had both loved. The children took turns visiting, bringing the grandchildren and great-grandchildren to say goodbye, though no one wanted to admit that was what they were doing. On a clear October evening, with the mountains visible through the bedroom window and the aspens turning gold outside, Quentin opened his eyes and looked at Penelope with perfect clarity. "Still the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice weak but certain. "Do not talk like you are leaving me," Penelope said, tears streaming down her face. "You promised we would grow old together. We are not done yet." "We are not done," Quentin agreed. "This is not goodbye, Penelope. This is just see you later. I will be waiting for you, wherever we go next." "I am not ready," Penelope whispered, clutching his hand. "I am not ready to let you go." "I know," Quentin said gently. "But remember what I told you. Keep living. Keep finding beauty. Keep being exactly who you are, the woman who is never too sentimental, who cares about things the way they should be cared about." "I love you," Penelope said, her voice breaking. "I have loved you since the moment you stepped between me and that bear. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Quentin replied. "You saved me, Penelope. You brought me back to life when I thought I was done living. Everything good in my life, our children, this home, this beautiful life we built, it all started with you." He reached up with his free hand and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks, just as he had done hundreds of times before. "Do not cry, darling, or actually, do cry. Cry all you want. Feel everything fully, just like you always have. That is who you are, and it is perfect." Those were the last words Quentin Jameson spoke. He closed his eyes a moment later, and with Penelope holding his hand and their children gathered around, he slipped peacefully away. The grief was overwhelming, Penelope felt as though part of her soul had been torn away, leaving a wound that could never fully heal. She cried for days, the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that come from the very core of one's being. But she was not alone. Her children surrounded her, holding her, crying with her, sharing their own grief and memories. They buried Quentin on a hillside overlooking the house they had built together, with the mountains rising behind and wildflowers planted around the grave. The entire community of Utica turned out for the funeral, proof of how many lives Quentin had touched despite his solitary nature. At the service, William spoke about his father's strength and courage. Margaret spoke about his gentle heart and patient nature. Thomas spoke about how he had taught them to respect the land and the creatures that lived on it. But it was Penelope who spoke last, her voice shaky but clear. "People used to tell me I was too sentimental," she said, "that I felt things too deeply, cared too much about beauty and goodness. But Quentin saw it differently. He told me I was perfect exactly as I was. He said I would care for his heart like it mattered, and I did. I cared for it with everything I had, and he cared for mine the same way." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, at her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, at the community that had become family over the years. "What Quentin taught me is that love is not about changing who you are to fit someone else's expectations. It is about finding someone who sees all of you, the strengths and the weaknesses, the joy and the sorrow, and loves you not in spite of those things, but because of them. He gave me that gift, and in return, I gave him a life filled with beauty and meaning and love. I would say we were both very lucky." After the funeral, life had to go on. Penelope returned to the house that now felt too empty, too quiet. For the first few weeks she struggled. Everything reminded her of Quentin. His coat still hung by the door, his coffee cup sat in the cupboard, his carvings filled the shelves. The bed felt enormous and cold without him in it, but slowly she began to remember her promise. She had told Quentin she would keep living, not just existing, and she intended to honor that promise. She started by maintaining their routines. She took her evening walks, even though Quentin was not there to hold her hand. She worked in the garden, planting the flowers he had loved. She continued her wood carving, trying to match the skill he had developed over years of practice. She also spent more time with the family. She became a fixture at William's house, helping with his youngest children. She attended every school play and recital that Margaret organized. She visited Thomas at the ranch, sitting on his porch and telling him stories about his father. And she cried. She cried at sunsets, at baby animals, at the sight of wildflowers in spring. She cried when she was happy and when she was sad, when something moved her deeply or touched her heart. She was still sentimental, still feeling everything fully, just as Quentin had loved. "Grandma, are you all right?" one of her great-grandchildren asked one evening, finding her on the porch with tears streaming down her face. "I am more than all right, sweetheart," Penelope assured her. "I'm just feeling grateful, grateful for all the beauty in the world, for all the love I have been given, for this family we have. Sometimes happiness and sadness feel like the same thing, and we cry because there are no words big enough to hold all the feelings." The child nodded seriously, as if she understood perfectly. Maybe she did. Maybe the capacity to feel deeply was something that passed down through generations, from grandmother to grandchild, a gift disguised as a flaw. The years passed. Penelope continued teaching, now well into her 80s, because she could not imagine stopping. She continued finding beauty in the small things, a perfect acorn, a bird's nest with eggs in it, the way morning light filtered through pine needles. She continued crying at beautiful things, and no one ever told her she was too sentimental anymore. In the spring of 1932, when Penelope was 79 years old, she was working in her garden when she felt a sudden pain in her chest. She sat down on the ground, her hands in the dirt, and looked up at the mountains Quentin had loved so much. William found her there a few hours later, peaceful and still, a small smile on her face. She had died the way she had lived, surrounded by beauty, with the mountains standing guard and wildflowers growing all around. They buried her next to Quentin on that hillside, reuniting them in death as they had been in life. The entire family gathered again, now spanning 4 generations. There were over 50 people there, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even a few great-great-grandchildren, all proof of the love that Penelope and Quentin had shared. At the funeral, the family took turns sharing memories. Stories about Grandma Penny, who cried at everything beautiful, and Grandpa Quentin, who said it was perfect. Stories about the house they had built, the life they had created, the love they had shared. Stories about how they had taught everyone in the family that feeling deeply was not a weakness, but a strength. William, now an old man himself, stood before his mother's grave and said, "My mother taught me that there is no such thing as being too sentimental. That caring deeply about the world, about people, about beauty and goodness, that is what makes us human. That is what makes life worth living. And my father saw that in her from the very beginning. He said she was perfect, and he was right." As the sun set behind the mountains that evening, painting the sky in shades Penelope would have wept over, the family gathered at the house for a celebration of her life. They told stories and looked through old photographs. They read passages from the journal Penelope had kept all those years, filled with observations about nature and family and the countless small miracles that made up a life. In one entry, dated from 1877, shortly after she had met Quentin, Penelope had written, "They said I was too sentimental, but Quentin said I was perfect. He said I would care for his heart like it matters, and I will. I will care for it like it is the most precious thing in the world, because it is. Because he is. And together, we will build something beautiful." And they had. Against all odds, in the harsh wilderness of the Montana frontier, a sentimental schoolteacher from Boston and a solitary mountain man had found each other and built something lasting. They had created a family, a home, and a legacy of love that continued to ripple outward through the generations. The house they built still stood, maintained now by Thomas's children. The wildflowers still bloomed every spring on the hillside where they were buried. And in every one of their descendants there lived a piece of Penelope and Quentin, the capacity to feel deeply, to find beauty in the world, to love without reservation. Years later, one of Penelope's great-great-granddaughters, a girl of about 20, sat on that same hillside, reading from Penelope's journal. She had inherited her great-great-grandmother's sensitivity, her tendency to cry at beautiful things, and she had been struggling with it, feeling like there was something wrong with her. But as she read Penelope's words, as she learned the story of how a woman who was told she was too sentimental found a man who thought she was perfect, something shifted inside her. She understood then that her sensitivity was not a flaw, but a gift, that the ability to feel deeply, to appreciate beauty, to care fully, these were strengths, not weaknesses. She wiped the tears from her cheeks and looked up at the mountains, the same mountains that had watched over Penelope and Quentin's love story. And she felt them there, somehow, in the wind and the wildflowers, in the beauty that surrounded her on every side. "Thank you," she whispered, to ancestors she had never met, but whose love had made her existence possible. "Thank you for showing me that it is all right to feel everything, that it is all right to be exactly who I am." And in that moment, sitting on a hillside in Montana with mountains rising behind her and wildflowers growing at her feet, she understood the truth that Penelope and Quentin had spent a lifetime proving, that the world needs people who feel deeply, who see beauty, who care about things like they matter. Because everything does matter. Every sunset, every flower, every moment of grace and beauty and love. The story of Penelope and Quentin became a family legend, passed down through the generations, growing and evolving with each telling. But at its core, it remained the same. A love story between two people who saw each other truly, who accepted each other completely, and who built something beautiful together in the wilderness. It was a story about finding home in another person, about discovering that the things the world sees as weaknesses might actually be your greatest strengths, about caring for someone's heart like it matters, because it does. Every heart matters, every feeling matters, every moment of connection matters. And so the legacy continued, long after Penelope and Quentin had passed from the world, living on in the family they had created and the love they had shared. Their house still stood as a testament to what could be built with patience and dedication. Their grave on the hillside became a place where family members went to find peace and perspective. Their story became the foundation on which future generations built their own lives and loves. In the end, they had been right, both of them. Penelope was perfect exactly as she was, with all her tears and feelings and sentimental heart, and she had cared for Quentin's heart like it was the most precious thing in the world. In return, he had given her the greatest gift possible: acceptance, understanding, and a love that lasted beyond death itself. They said she was too sentimental. The mountain man said she was perfect, and she would care for his heart like it mattered. And she did for over 40 years, through hardship and joy, through tears and laughter, through all the beauty and heartbreak that makes up a human life. And that, in the end, was the whole story, a love that saw past flaws to strengths, that built beauty in a harsh wilderness, that lasted not just a lifetime but beyond it, rippling forward through time in the lives of everyone they had touched. It was a story written in tears and laughter, in wildflowers and mountain peaks, in every sunset they had watched together and every child they had raised. It was a story that proved, beyond any doubt, that there is no such thing as being too sentimental when you are caring for a heart that matters. And every heart matters, every single one.